Amazingly, I found out that fiber has nothing to do with all this.
So if we just dwell for a moment on that, that's the GIP. It's a hormone released from the gut, depending on what you eat, will affect how it's released. And it signals to adipose tissue, and you don't want it too high or too often or too chronically high.
It signals to bones, it signals to adipose tissues, but yeah, the first action that was recognized was signaling to the pancreas, to beta cells and alpha cells. And what it does is it increases the insulin response, so to blood glucose. Actually, it can double or triple the insulin response to blood glucose. And it also signals the alpha cells to release more glucagon. There is another gut hormone related. The two together are called incretins. And that's basically what I just explained. They increase the insulin response to glucose and other nutrients. And that's called GIP-1. That's a more benign type of incretin, but it's always kind of weird to say something is harmful or benign in the body, because there is a reason it's there. It was not put there so that it can do some harm to you, obviously.
Absolutely, but depending on what you force it to do and dysregulating it, GIP, GLP-1 have to work in the sense evolutionary as they were intended, otherwise you screw the control system. Yeah. So if maybe where GIP is released and where GLP is released, because these ones are very important in magnifying and accelerating insulin action, also glucagon, which is the kind of yang to insulin's yin, and also having lots of effects on adipocytes, which are very important. So these two guys maybe work through the digestive system. Where are they, and what causes them to behave in a good way in your mind? What kinds of foods and things would cause them to behave badly?
Yeah, so just going one step back.
Okay.
That was when I arrived to insulin as a major problem. I mean, hyperinsulinemia or high insulin as a major problem, and regular, frequent high insulin loads. And that is the reason I called the Facebook group Lower Insulin, because I recognize that lowering these frequent high insulin responses is extremely beneficial. But then that was an organic next step to go upstream and try to find why we have this high insulin response, and to what foods, or is it related to foods at all? And then I started looking into the gut physiology. And as you know me, I started reading a lot of basic papers first, how the intestines are organized, and what endocrine cells there are. These are called enteroendocrine cells, and how these are splattered in the gut, and how they sense different nutrients, and how this sensing of nutrients contributes or determines their hormonal response, and how this hormonal response are linked to the insulin response, and then how insulin is linked to the adipose, and adipose is linked to the liver, and then how you develop diabetes. So I went back, and really amazingly, I suddenly found in a place where I was kind of an industrial expert already. And that was starch processing, industrial starch processing. I recognize that it has really a lot to do with starch processing, and in general food processing, but mainly with starch processing. So depending on what kind of starchy food, we can say sugary food, but it's up to different processing forms of fruits mainly. But coming back to starch and starchy foods, I started looking into how the structure of plant materials, how the structure of starch itself, and how different starches, resistant starches, and so on and so forth, and fiber influence these hormonal responses in the gut. And amazingly, I found out that fiber has nothing to do with all this. It's all about the structure of the plant food, and how, in what way you disrupt the plant structure So how you make it available for the starch degrading enzymes called amylases, that determines 99% what happens with the starchy food in your gut.
Right, so if you take plant foods, there are starches, sugars, essentially that's where we get our starches and sugars, our plant foods. If you basically disrupt the cellular structure significantly, you may greatly change how healthy they are in your body. But if you put back in fiber as an additional component, that's pointless.
It's 99% pointless. There is only one exception I know, when you add such a fiber that makes so high viscosity in your stomach that it kind of holds back the food for a longer period of time, and there is a slower release of. But that food you don't really want to eat, I believe.
No, no, you'll have all kinds of other problems, and that's niche. But essentially the key point is, it's not just that the fiber is lost from the processing, because if you add the fiber
that's a good surrogate, actually. Well, that's a good surrogate marker, the processing out the fiber. This is closely correlated to this disrupting the structure, but we are talking about two different things still.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's so important. It's worth re-emphasizing yet again for the viewer that the removal of fiber is a great proxy for causing damage to the cellular structure that will cause you a problem.
Yeah.
But it's not the removal of the fiber that is the problem.
No.
It just
you can leave in all the fiber and still disrupt the structure to an extent that you will see no difference between the two metabolic responses.
Exactly.
All the fiber in and all the fiber removed, and still basically no difference between the response. It's not about the fiber, it's the structure that kind of retards or retains the starch within a capsule, within a granule, and then it's more slowly released from this granule.
Right, so now we're down to the very nub of what you can do badly in your diet to set the whole chain of events off that we discussed. And it comes down largely to how much you have disrupted or changed the structure of the starches in plant foods and how that affects your body. So let's say the worst case then. The best case would be to have completely natural tubers or vegetables, that all the cellular structure is intact, and maybe view those best carbohydrate foods going through your body, GIP, GLP.
I give you an example of a raw potato or mashed potato, boiled and mashed potato. That's a good example, I think. So basically how these hormone secreting cells are scattered in your gut is that the so-called K cells, which produce the GIP, they are up in the duodenum, the first short part of the small intestines, right after your stomach. And the big majority is in the duodenum. And the other one, the GLP-1, it's a little bit tricky because there are a few in your duodenum as well, and these are responsible for the so-called cephalic phase of insulin release. But that's just a detour. Sorry about that. But most of them are scattered in a reverse or inverse funnel shape, so that you have a few up in your gut, and as you go further with your food in your small and also in the large intestines, you have more and more of them. So basically what you see is that if food is quickly absorbed in the first short part of the small intestine, then you mainly and only stimulate GIP. And if you eat something which is difficult to digest and is slowly absorbed along the whole pipeline, then you get a much more balanced response. So you get some from the upper part, and then you get some from the lower part. And that's what I call a balanced incretin response. And when you eat raw potato, then exactly that's what happens.
So some triggering of GIP, but then the food product by its nature, cellular, structurally complete, moves on down to the ileum and triggers quite a lot of GLP-1, which we can see as the positive or more positive hormone in a sense. And you get an optimal insulin response and an optimal control system.
It kind of antagonizes some of the effects of the GIP. So that's what you see when you only stimulate one, you see it as harmful. But when you stimulate both, or even more of the beneficial one, then it can have a kind of a reversing effect on metabolic problems.
This is Ivor in post-production here, and I just wanted to step in briefly. There were a few points that Gabor didn't get to raise during this interview, and one of them I'd like to go through briefly. So basically you can see in the slide here what Gabor has been talking about. You've got your K cells higher in your digestive system, where the GIP is released, and highly processed foods tend to get absorbed too greatly here and over excite GIP, which is problematic. More dense non-processed foods, unprocessed, move more down the digestive system to the ileum, where you'll see the L cells that release GLP-1 and other somewhat beneficial hormones. So you need a balance. But one good example of how powerful the balance between these K and L cells are is the gastric bypass surgery. So you can see here on the right hand side, Roux-en-Y is the most powerful and effective gastric bypass surgery, and they do reduce the stomach in size, but what really is important about this surgery is they bypass the K cells and they direct more of the food to the L cells where the GLP-1 is released. So they reduce the GIP response and they increase the GLP-1 and PYY response also. And this has quite a dramatic effect because when you get this surgery, long before weight loss is experienced, within the first few weeks, you get a massive improvement in blood glucose control, way before the weight loss. And essentially the diabetic type GIP to GLP-1 signaling, the ratios, is reversed by the surgery and the signaling is restored. And this essentially proves by seeing a massive improvement in the metabolism in the first couple of weeks after surgery, long before weight loss is affected, essentially proves the points that Gabor is making. And now we'll return to the interview. So raw unprocessed carbohydrate, like you say, a raw potato, or there's many other examples, will tend to have a balanced incretin response with GIP, GLP-1.
Exactly. Yes.
And probably you can eat them for a long time along with healthy fats and healthy other nutritious foods and be okay, like those ancient people.
Exactly.
But if you go to the mashed potato, maybe with a little bit of fat in there as well, just to shake things up.
Unfortunately, fat is another nutrient that is very potent. That is very potently capable of stimulating GIP. So just when you add butter on your mashed potato, you are just doubling the effect.
But interesting, Gabor, this is a key point, I believe. So if you put in lots of mashed potato and smashed up, or like cornflakes or any of this crap, it will overstimulate GIP overly early and less for GLP-1. That's fine, and that over time is a negative thing.
Yeah.
If you drop in fat with this carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate, I think it potentiates or multiplies the GIP response effect.
Yeah, it can greatly exaggerate the response. Yeah.
Exaggerate, but probably an important thing for people is, if you just ate the healthy fat on its own with no carbohydrate, I think the GIP is a relatively muted response.
If you are healthy.
If you are healthy.
Then that's the case. If you are metabolically deranged already, then you will see this response also from pure fat.
Yes, but the key point, I think, is that if you, through a healthier low-carb, higher fat diet and no processed vegetable oils, no processed carb, over a period of weeks or months, you retain your metabolic health, I guess you may then be a person...
If you eat whole foods of any kind, there is no problem. And that's pretty much in line what you see with hunter-gatherer groups, or all the information if you process from blue zones and everything. If they stick to whole foods, it's not a big problem.
And there certainly is the case that very high carb, ultra low fat is a specific route to insulin sensitivity through other mechanisms, but broadly you're putting the processing of the food as the crucial linchpin of our epidemics.
Yeah, that's a certain type of processing, and it's difficult to define what processing is. I mean, our ancestors 50,000, 200,000 years ago, they cooked their food, they cooked their tubers, starchy tubers, and we're still okay. So what is the good processing and what is the bad processing? It's very difficult to tell, and that's where people are usually also challenged by the industry, challenged by plant-based diet proponents and all this kind of guys okay, but what is processing? These guys also process their food and they are just doing fine. So, and that's where I spent the last 1.5 years reading about what type of processing, and the type of processing is important, but also the proportion of these processed foods in our diets. So, and this is where fiber comes into the picture as a good proxy. You can follow, for example, carbohydrate content of average food. I mean the average consumption of carbohydrates from the early 1900s to basically today, and what you see is a mild U-shaped curve. So it was high, it went down a bit, and then it went up again. But when you add the fiber content of that carbohydrate food, you see a huge discrepancy. Carbohydrate content has been going up steadily since the late 70s or so, but the fiber content has been going down steadily. And that's not the fiber again. It's a good proxy for the proportion of the ultra refined processed foods what we eat.
Exactly. So the fiber going down is just a reflection of the processing, which is really the key thing. So essentially, again, the point arises that if the guys processing, the industry, put fiber back in, right, in powder form or whatever, it'll make no difference. It's only a proxy. So really what you're saying,
it will score higher on some health authority scores, but otherwise
it will, exactly. It will improve a number for
does no good
for some bureaucrat. So it's as distracting as the calories are all the same.
Fiber is similar to calories, actually.
Yes, nonsense. But then we've got a spectrum of processing, and if we put aside fiber as a proxy, because it's a dangerous proxy, because if the guys put it back in, they'll hide the signal. So if we put aside fiber, we've got a spectrum of processing from minimal processing ancestral back in the hundreds of years ago, which didn't cause much trouble.
And the proportion of these foods.
And the proportion in the diet, but let's assume the more of them is a problem if they're processed. But what about just the spectrum of processing? Assuming you eat a lot of processed carb, from minimal through to, I guess, ultra, where the cellular structure of the carbohydrates is broken and they're rapid release and GIP antagonizing. That's a spectrum.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, spot on. It's very difficult to define where the, I don't know if there is a personal threshold, for example. What you see is that the more white flour, for example, you eat, but even white flour doesn't tell you the whole picture. That's the interesting thing. Let me give you an example. You compare, for example, wholemeal pasta with white bread. And what you see that white bread, I mean, same amount of available carbohydrates, let's say 60 grams. The white bread elicits something like a 5-fold insulin response and a 6-8-fold GIP response compared to the wholemeal pasta, because traditional pasta is very dense and it contains protein, and it contains I think a lot of pasta contains egg proteins, for example. They add eggs to the, and here in Hungary we even highlight on the package of the pasta that it's made with 4 eggs or 8 eggs or whatever. And then when you add more eggs, then you create a more dense structure, and it's all about the structure, as we just discussed. It's all about the structure. So with actually with a high protein content pasta, you can get a fairly normal hormonal response. And I know that a lot of keto guys will dismiss this as this guy is eating pasta and promoting pasta. No, I don't eat pasta, and I don't promote pasta, but that's where the science is.
We have to be honest about it. I mean, in terms of deleterious effects, in this axis...
And that may be the reason behind the Italian paradox. So why are Italians not obese? I mean, all of them, because they eat a lot of pasta. Pasta is not so bad, actually.
Well, I think you'd have to qualify that though. The amount absolutely eat is actually traditionally not that high. It was a small dish. That's one factor, so the absolute. The other thing is they were maybe eating very traditional, certain types of wheat pasta with a lot of protein and egg. What do you get in the supermarket now in bags? I'm reckoning it's the cheapest crap that they can possibly make and get away with it. And probably
most likely.
So you'd need a study on all the different types of pastas versus the white breads. But your point is well taken though. There's a spectrum of processing. But what we're saying here is the processing of the food in the modern age, again, is a linchpin. And there are many surprising foods that you might consider highly processed, yet they do not elicit a bad response so much. And there are other ones you may think are not too processed, and they can be really bad. What we need is to get all this defined and have health warnings based on the type of food, get rid of the calories junk, and get rid of all the other misconceptions, and get into what actually drives human health, or the opposite. It's huge.
It would be great. I mean, if somebody developed kind of metrics of on the labels that GIP, GLP, and insulin responses to this pasta were or are expected to be, that would be really nice. I don't expect it to happen anytime soon.
No, I certainly don't, and I'm sure industry would have no interest in creating such a system, because in general, if you look at correlates, the margin on a processed food product also probably correlates with how poor it is in terms of human health. I'm guessing, we won't say that, but if you go and you categorize all of the processed foods, I'm reckoning the cheapest junk in general, highly processed vegetable oils, highly processed by your definition grains, without the protein and eggs. Generally, those foods won't
without
be...
the structure.
The structure.
To be precise,
Oh yeah, the structure. It seems to enable highly processed foods and shelf life to smash the structure to nothing and then remake it into what you want. Okay, so that's really interesting. One last question on that, because I think we've got to the root of this sphere of influence on health. There are others, of course, but on this one. But one other thing is, if you are metabolically damaged and you have sustained diabetic dysfunction, and you are one of those people in trouble from decades of bad foods, if you are that person, might you be more sensitive to less bad carbohydrates than your ancestors might have been?
Yeah, I mean, low carbohydrate diets work because you basically remove almost all carbohydrates. So by just coincidence, you remove all the bad carbohydrates as well. So that's one thing. And then I think removing processed foods or disrupted foods with disrupted structure. That's the most. Plant foods with disrupted structure. There is a small effect on protein processing. You can hydrolyze protein and eat these powders, and it's a little bit worse than eating whole proteins, but the difference is small.
I agreed. And the fats, again, whether you process them or not molecularly, it doesn't make so much difference. We're talking here carbohydrates processing, which is overwhelmingly from the plant world. But to take that one step further, if you take someone who has diabetic dysfunction and they're very dysfunctional, they've got serious metabolic issues, our ancestors may have been able to take stone ground wheaten bread in some quantity without adverse effects. But a diabetic person now who is damaged, could they eat the same amounts of stone ground wheaten bread?
I respectfully disagree on the stone ground. If you have a look at the Egyptian mummies, you know, Michael Eads published some blog posts on that. It's not really that benign, but okay.
True, I would not eat stone ground breads either, but let's just say our ancestors could tolerate them more if they were generally metabolically healthy. But what about someone who has been damaged by modern processed food? The low carbohydrate is the extra layer of safety they need, probably like having baked potatoes and all that is not ideal for those people anymore.
If you are metabolically challenged, meaning you are insulin resistant or straight diabetic, go on an animal-based diet and go on a whole foods-based diet. And after fixing your problems, you may consider or some say you should consider increasing the proportion of plants and whole plants in your diet.
There's no particular reason to, but maybe.
I don't think there is, but yeah, you can go even plant-based if you want.
If you wish, and go very high carb, ultra low fat, which is another precarious route to a diet that can work. So if you're metabolically challenged, as you said, Gabor, we just said 10 minutes ago, maybe 60% plus of American adults are essentially diabetic or in that sphere. So we're saying the large majority, it's low carb at least, and maybe when you fixed yourself, you can see, can you toy with higher carb?
Yeah, start out with low plant. If low plant or no plant, then you have no issues with plant processing, I can guarantee.
That's guaranteed.
And after, I think what you can expect is a profound impact, a huge impact on your metabolism, huge beneficial improvement.
With the same calories as you ate before, absolutely.
Don't count calories, forget about that. Eat whole animals from nose to tail. Then everything is in there, what you need for fixing your metabolism. And then after your markers, your obesity, insulin resistance, fatty liver, all your ailments improve a lot, then you can consider to what extent you add back plants and just minimally processed plant food.
Yeah, you would never want to add in processed food again, because that's what kind of wrecked you in the first place.
I think that initially you should also avoid pure fats, so that drinking whipping cream, as long as you are metabolically challenged, is not really a good idea.
No.
But after that, it's an option, just as eating plants.
Exactly. So I think these added oils and fats don't make much sense when you should be eating real whole foods at all. And indeed, there's the case of the ApoE4 genotype, which I am, and my wife is, and my supporter David Bobbitt. And there is some evidence to say that ApoE4 who have become metabolically damaged might be safer being a bit careful on the animal fat and protein, and maybe more fish and avocado is safer in their state. Again, with time, they'd have to carefully reintroduce and find that what optimizes their blood metrics.
I can highly recommend pastured lard and pastured goose fat. That's very high in unsaturated fats, especially monounsaturated fats. So no problem with animal fats, but don't go heavy on dairy, especially dairy, as long as you are metabolically challenged. When it's over, I think adding quite a large amount of whipping cream, as I do nowadays, is fine.
Yeah, when fully recovered. And you'll need all the blood metrics we talked about to ascertain that you've arrived, and the calcium scan if you have a heart disease issue, which is best flagged by the calcium scan. Then a couple of years with a new regime and fixing your blood metrics, you can check back with a quick 5-minute calcium scan and verify your progression has halted or at least leveled off as the ultimate acid test. Thank you very much, Gabor. An absolute delight. So now let's have lunch.
Oh, fine.
Eventually. Thank you.
Thanks.